birthday, my daughter looked me in the eye and said, "Why are you even here? This is not your place anymore." The words fell like stones, heavier than any silence I had known. Around the long, polished table, laughter echoed, glasses clinking, jokes shared, whispers spilling like wine, but none of it reached me. My seat at the far end was not just distant, it was foreign. I sat there like a stranger in a house I had once built with my own hands. A house where every corner still carried the weight of my sacrifices, though no one seemed to remember. She said it openly, not in a whisper meant to shame me quietly, but in a voice sharp enough to cut through the air. The room froze for just a second, then moved on, as if my dignity were nothing but a chair scraped across the floor. Her husband smirked faintly, as though to confirm her cruelty, while the children kept their heads lowered over glowing screens, giggling at things I would never be part of. I could hear them laugh, but it sounded like mockery, mockery of my age, my silence, my very existence. I had come because it was family, because even when uninvited, my heart carried an invitation of its own. A father does not need to be asked to love. But that night I realized that love unacknowledged turns into a burden. I was no longer seen as the man who gave, who worked, who built. I was seen as someone who simply lingered, occupying a seat that in their minds belonged to someone else. The roast was carved, the wine poured, candles flickered with warmth. But none of it touched me. I was cold in the very center of the home I had once filled with warmth. I looked at her, my own daughter, and I did not see the child I once carried on my shoulders. I saw a woman hardened by comfort, blind to the roots beneath her feet, dismissing the very soil from which she had grown. "Why are you even here?" she asked again, softer now, but no less cruel, like a blade pressed rather than swung. She wanted me to leave, not in words, but in shame. She wanted me to recognize myself as unnecessary, a relic sitting too close to her life's brightness. I did not answer. I did not argue. My silence was not weakness. It was the weight of years she could not yet understand. But inside, beneath the stillness of my face, something broke. Something that had been breaking slowly over time, with every insult, every sigh, every rolled eye, every dismissal of my place in this family. And so I sat at the table of exclusion, not as a father, not as a guest, but as an intruder among my own blood. And though my daughter did not know it yet, though she thought she was cutting me down, she had only drawn nearer to the moment when truth would speak for me. Truth written not in anger, but in ink, in the quiet folds of a paper resting in my jacket, waiting for the night her words demanded it to be seen. Friends, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening from? Has something like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you're helping us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, let's continue. He did not answer. Silence had become his second skin, worn down over years of glances that dismissed him, sighs that pushed him aside, words that told him to let the younger ones handle it. He had been reduced before, reduced to a shadow lingering in the corner of rooms where once his voice had guided every decision. But nothing cut as sharply as hearing his own daughter turn his presence into a burden, as though his very existence were an intrusion in the world he had worked to create for her. The food on the table glistened under the lights, golden and rich, yet it tasted of ashes to him. Every smile exchanged across the table reminded him of the years when he used to sit at the head, when his opinion mattered, when laughter carried warmth rather than exclusion. Back then, his stories filled the room. Stories of hardship, of endurance, of building a life from scraps so they could sit in comfort today. Now those same stories were treated as ramblings of an old man whose time had passed. He sat still, his hands resting on his lap, his back straight, not out of pride, but out of habit. He remembered nights spent bending over blueprints until dawn, the ache of his body ignored so his children would never know hunger. He remembered standing in the rain, waiting for his daughter to come out of school, holding an umbrella above her head while his own shoulders were soaked through. He remembered selling the watch his father had given him so her tuition would be paid without delay. Those sacrifices had been invisible, as though swallowed by time, and now, as she looked at him with disdain, he realized they had been erased completely in her heart. There was no need for raised voices to remind him of his place. The way her husband poured the wine without offering him a glass was enough. The way her children passed dishes around without sliding one toward him told him everything. He had been pushed to the edges, not with force, but with indifference, the cruelest dismissal of all. To be unseen is worse than to be hated. Hatred at least admits you exist. Indifference makes you vanish while your body still breathes. And yet, beneath the weight of humiliation, something else stirred. Not anger. Anger burns out quickly. Not revenge. It poisons the one who drinks it first. What stirred in him was quieter, older, heavier. It was the unshakable knowledge of who he truly was, the proof that no insult could erase. His daughter believed she had reduced him to nothing, but she had only dimmed her own memory. The truth remained alive, folded in a paper within his jacket, waiting with the patience of years. He sat there, watching the meal continue, laughter moving like a river around a stone. He did not move. He did not speak. To them, he was less than he had ever been, a silent figure occupying space at their table. But deep inside, he knew, being reduced in their eyes did not change the weight of his name, the value of his work, or the legacy they were too blind to see. He remembered the decades of sacrifice as if they were etched into his bones. Nights when he left one shift only to walk straight into another, the sky never dark or light enough for him to call it morning or night. His body had carried exhaustion like a permanent garment, yet he never let it break him, because at home there were mouths to feed, children to clothe, dreams that were not his own but that he carried as if they were heavier than stone. He remembered skipping meals, pretending he wasn't hungry so they would never feel the emptiness gnawing at their stomachs. He remembered patching his shoes again and again so his daughter could have new ones every September, so she would never feel different from the children of men who worked less, earned more, and sacrificed nothing. These years were invisible now, buried beneath their laughter and their disdain. They saw him not as the man who once carried them on his shoulders, but as a shadow, lingering at the edge of their comfort. They looked at his silence and mistook it for weakness, at his age and mistook it for irrelevance. They had forgotten the strong hands that had once built their safety, the steady back that bore every hardship so they could stand upright today. He sat there, remembering the winters when his hands cracked from cold, when he walked home in snow with holes in his gloves, carrying gifts wrapped in paper he could barely afford, gifts that his daughter tore open with joy. He remembered the day she graduated, her smile shining while he stood at the back of the hall because he could not afford a proper suit, clapping with the pride of 10 fathers, though she never looked his way. He remembered the long hours he bent over ledgers and bills, moving numbers like soldiers, making sure the lights stayed on, the house stayed warm, the fridge was never empty. But memory is cruel when it stands beside betrayal. For all the years he had poured into her life, for all the nights he had swallowed his hunger so she would never know it, all that remained in her eyes now was an old man, too quiet to matter, too slow to keep up, too unnecessary to be given a seat of honor at her table. His sacrifices had been swallowed whole, leaving nothing but the husk of a father they believed had outlived his usefulness. And yet, as the weight of invisible years pressed against him, he realized those years were not wasted. They were not gone, only hidden, waiting for the moment when truth would lift them from shadow into light. Because what they had chosen to forget, he had preserved. What they had dismissed, he had written down. And though they could not see it now, though they reduced him to irrelevance, his years were not invisible to the paper folded in his jacket, the paper that carried every sacrifice, every struggle, every unseen night, and turned them into something undeniable. Her husband smirked, the kind of smirk that wasn't loud but carried a weight heavier than laughter. It was the smirk of someone who believed he stood higher, who believed the man at the end of the table had no claim, no right, no presence that mattered. The children giggled behind their glowing phones, their fingers tapping, their eyes glancing up only to see him as something to laugh at, a relic seated among them, too old to understand, too quiet to resist. He sat there not as a father, not as the one who once carried the whole of their lives upon his shoulders, but as a guest, unwelcome in a home his own blood occupied. Every gesture confirmed it. The way they passed the dishes from hand to hand but skipped his plate as though by accident. The way the husband poured wine generously for everyone but left his glass empty. The way the daughter looked away whenever his eyes found hers. It was not hatred, it was worse. It was the cold dismissal of a man stripped of worth, treated as though his very breathing were an intrusion on their comfort. He remembered when this house had been nothing but a frame of wood and dust. He had walked through it with tools on his belt, with hands raw from labor, and carved it into a home. He remembered when the laughter of children had once been his joy, not his humiliation, when they ran to him with open arms, not with half-hidden smiles behind a screen. He remembered when he was the man they turned to for strength, the man who made the impossible possible. Now, in the eyes of his daughter's family, he was none of that. He was a body taking up space, a presence too small to matter, too inconvenient to acknowledge. Every bite of food tasted bitter, though he hardly ate. Every word exchanged across the table fell like a reminder that he no longer belonged to them. He was there in flesh, but in their hearts he had already been dismissed, erased, reduced to something unnecessary. The worst wound was not their words, but their indifference, how easily they lived as though he were invisible. The husband leaned back in his chair, relaxed, certain of his place, while the children's laughter spilled quietly like a current of mockery. The daughter, silent now, did nothing to stop it. And in that silence, in that smirk, in that laughter, he understood. They no longer saw him as father, as provider, as man. They saw him as nothing. But beneath his stillness, beneath his weathered hands folded in his lap, truth waited. They did not know the weight of what he carried, the years they had chosen to forget, the legacy written in documents they had never seen. To them, he was an intruder in his own bloodline, but to himself, he was still the foundation. And one day, one moment, the stone they rejected would become the cornerstone they could no longer ignore. He did not argue. To argue would have been to stoop to their level, to wrestle with shadows that would never see light. He did not beg for space because a man who has given his life to others should not have to beg for what he already earned. Instead, in the stillness that hung heavy around him, he let his hand slip into the inside pocket of his worn jacket. The fabric was frayed at the edges, a jacket he had owned for years, carrying with it the smell of rain and smoke, the marks of time. But inside, close to his chest, lay something untouched by decay, something no insult, no dismissal, no cruelty could erase. The paper rested there like a heartbeat. He had carried it not as a weapon, not as a boast, but as a reminder of who he truly was. Folded and refolded, its corners softened, its ink still sharp with truth. Every time he felt the sting of their rejection, he had touched it, as if to remind himself that his worth was not in their approval, but in the life he had carved, in the legacy they had forgotten. Tonight, the weight of that paper seemed heavier than ever, pressing against his heart, demanding to be revealed. Around him, the laughter returned. His son-in-law leaned close to his daughter, whispering something that made her lips curl into a smile, not at him, but at his expense. The children clutched their phones tighter, recording moments of joy they would one day look back on and forget he was even present. The food moved across the table, the wine glasses clinked, and still no one offered him anything but silence. He could have left. He could have stood, pushed the chair back, and walked into the night without a word. But leaving would have given them what they wanted, proof that he no longer belonged. No. His silence would end, not with words, but with truth. The kind of truth that could not be mocked, that could not be ignored, that could not be erased by the arrogance of those who thought themselves above him. His fingers brushed the folded edges. The decision was made. Quiet but unshakable. He would not raise his voice. He would not curse or condemn. He would simply lay the truth before them and let the weight of it settle across the table, heavier than their laughter, sharper than their disdain. They had mocked his presence, questioned his right to sit among them, treated him as less than family. Soon they would see the folly of their blindness. Soon they would realize that the man they thought irrelevant had carried their future in his hands all along. As his hand lingered in his pocket, feeling the pulse of the paper against his chest, his eyes lifted to the daughter who had told him he did not belong. She did not know that in mere moments, everything she thought she owned, everything she believed was hers by right, would turn back to him, to the father she had cast aside. And though she would not see it yet, the quiet decision had already been made. The night would not end in humiliation, but in truth. It was folded neatly, edges worn soft by years of being carried close to his heart, as if the truth it held had soaked into the very fibers of the paper. The ink inside had not faded, the letters still strong, bearing his name with a weight that could not be erased. It was not just paper, it was blood turned into words, sacrifice turned into signatures, a lifetime pressed into black lines that proved what no voice in that room wanted to admit. He was not irrelevant. He was the foundation beneath them all. With quiet hands he drew it out, not rushing, not trembling. The laughter at the table dulled for a moment, confused at his movement, then fell into a silence that spread like fire when they saw what he carried. He did not speak. He did not need to. The gesture itself was louder than anger, more cutting than any shouted word. He laid it on the table before his daughter, his fingers resting for a breath upon its surface, as though leaving behind a piece of his very soul. The paper lay between them like a mirror. She had spoken her cruelty as if her voice had power to erase him. But the statement stared back at her, unflinching, undeniable. She reached toward it, hesitation trembling through her hand, as though she already sensed what it contained. Her husband leaned forward, his smirk faltering, the color draining from his face. The children stopped giggling, their glowing phones forgotten, their eyes fixed on the single folded truth that shifted the weight of the entire room. Inside, it carried his signature, his authority, the legal testament of his will, an inheritance statement that bore not just numbers and assets, but the undeniable legacy of a man they had mocked. The house they sat in, the comfort they enjoyed, the future they believed theirs by right, all of it had his name carved into its foundation. In one simple motion, without raising his voice, without lifting his head, he had turned the balance of power. He was no longer the intruder, he was the owner. He was the root. The silence after the paper touched the table was heavier than any insult. It pressed into their chests, suffocating, unavoidable. His daughter stared, her lips parting but no words escaping. Her husband's hand twitched as though he wanted to reach for it but dared not. The children shifted in their seats, eyes darting, no longer certain whether to laugh or to bow their heads in shame. And he sat there, still, his eyes steady, his face unreadable. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He let the truth breathe for itself. The inheritance statement needed no champion. It was its own voice, carrying years of sacrifice and love they had buried, now unearthed in black ink. They had asked why he was here as though he were an unwanted shadow, but now the table itself seemed to whisper back, He was here because everything they touched had been his first. The room froze, as if time itself had been caught in the act of breathing. Forks hung in the air, wine glasses hovered unfinished near lips suddenly dry, and the laughter that had danced so easily only moments ago died a swift and awkward death. The air thickened, every second stretching long, the weight of silence pressing harder than any argument could. His daughter stared at the folded paper before her, the edges worn yet defiant, and her voice, once sharp, once so eager to cut him down, trembled into nothing. She reached for it slowly, as though touching it might scorch her skin. Her fingers hovered above the page, afraid to lift it, afraid to open it, because even without reading, she already knew what it was. The truth radiated from it like heat from embers, quiet, steady, undeniable. She pressed her palm against it at last, and the contact was like fire. It burned not her skin, but her pride, searing through the cruel words she had spoken, branding her with the weight of what she had tried to forget. Her husband shifted uncomfortably, the smirk gone from his lips, replaced by a nervous tightness in his jaw. He glanced at her, then at the man at the far end of the table. The man he had dismissed. The man he had thought powerless, only to realize he had been sitting in the presence of authority all along. The children, their phones still glowing in their hands, no longer giggled. Their eyes darted between their mother's pale face and their grandfather's stillness, realizing dimly that the figure they had mocked was not a relic, but the reason they had anything at all. The silence stretched. No one dared to speak. Every corner of the room seemed to echo with what had been unsaid for years. That he had given everything. That he had built their comfort. That without him, this table, this house, this family would not exist. And now, with nothing but a sheet of paper, he had forced them to confront it. His daughter's throat tightened. The words she had flung so carelessly, "Why are you even here?" returned to her now like chains. She saw the truth in her father's weathered face, in the steadiness of his eyes, in the quiet strength of the hand that had placed the statement before her. It was not anger that held him upright. It was dignity, carved by years of sacrifice, stronger than the walls around them. Still he did not speak. He let the silence grow until it swallowed the whole room, until the laughter that had once excluded him was replaced by shame that included them all. They had reduced him to nothing, but now nothing could reduce him. His legacy was ink, his presence undeniable, and his silence, his terrible, unshakable silence, spoke louder than any words he could ever say. Her husband leaned closer, his body betraying a nervous stiffness he could no longer disguise. The easy arrogance that had rested so comfortably on his shoulders drained away, leaving only the pale outline of disbelief. His smirk, the weapon he had used so often to cut through the old man's silence, crumbled into nothing. His eyes fell upon the inheritance statement, bold letters etched in dark ink, letters that did not waver, did not stammer, did not bend. They spoke with a force no voice could rival. This man was not a guest, not an intruder, not a relic to be ignored. He was the owner of everything they touched, everything they consumed, everything they believed was theirs by right. The paper revealed what arrogance had blinded him to see. The house in which he lounged so comfortably was not his wife's triumph, not his own accomplishment, but a gift born of the man at the far end of the table. The food upon the plates, the roof above their heads, the security they flaunted, it all carried the weight of the father's name. For years he had treated him as a shadow, as a burden tolerated out of duty, but in this single moment the truth overturned every illusion. He was not living beside weakness. He had been living off strength. A chill settled over him. He saw his children staring, wide-eyed, suddenly aware that the grandfather they mocked was the foundation they stood on. He glanced at his wife, her face pale, her hand trembling over the document as though it might split her skin. He searched for words, but words were useless against ink, against signatures, against truth pressed into legal permanence. The arrogance that had shielded him collapsed, leaving him naked in shame. He remembered every time he had rolled his eyes when the old man entered the room, every time he had dismissed his stories, every time he had whispered to his wife that her father should stay out of the way. Each memory now echoed like a curse. He had thought himself higher, stronger, the rightful heir to command this house, but in reality he had been nothing more than a guest permitted to stay in another man's legacy. The silence pressed harder. He wanted to laugh, to speak, to protest, but all he could do was sit there with his face stripped of pride. The inheritance statement did not just expose the truth, it humiliated him without a single word spoken, and across the table the old man's stillness was louder than fury. His silence was not weakness, it was judgment. It was justice delivered without raising a voice. The children who had once hidden their giggles behind glowing screens now sat frozen, their laughter dead in their throats. Only moments ago they had mocked his worn jacket, his scuffed shoes, the way he sat so quietly as if he did not belong. To them he had been nothing more than an old man, clinging to a place that wasn't his. But now, with a single piece of paper laid upon the table, the truth had torn away their shallow illusions. They no longer saw a relic. They saw the man who had held their lives steady when they were too young to understand what it cost him. They saw the foundation beneath their comfort, the invisible strength that had carried them through every year of safety and ease. Their eyes shifted, restless, unable to meet his gaze. One of them set the phone down, ashamed of the half-recorded video that now felt cruel, meaningless, childish. They thought of the stories they had rolled their eyes at, of the moments when they dismissed him as irrelevant, when they mocked his silence. But silence, they understood now, was not weakness. It was power, waiting for its moment. The house they lived in, the table they ate at, the security they took for granted. Every stone, every wall, every breath of comfort had been born of his labor, his sacrifices, his unyielding will. They thought of birthdays when the gifts seemed endless, never questioning how those gifts appeared, never imagining the long hours he had worked so they would never feel less than others. They thought of winter coats that warmed them while he walked in the cold with shoes that leaked. They thought of school fees paid without delay, of doors always open, of lights always on, of fridges always full. They thought of all these things, and for the first time, they understood that none of it had come from luck. None of it had fallen from the sky. It had come from him, the man they had just mocked, the man they had thought small. Shame spread across their faces like a storm. Their cheeks burned, their eyes lowered, their laughter dissolved into the heavy weight of guilt. They realized they had been laughing not at a weakness, but at the very strength that had shaped their lives. He had been the bridge between their innocence and survival, and they had spat upon it without knowing. Now, sitting across from him, they could not bring themselves to speak, for even their voices would have sounded like betrayal. And still he did not demand their apology. He did not lift his head to shame them further. He sat as he always had, quiet, dignified, steady as stone. Yet that very stillness condemned them more than any rebuke. In his silence, they saw everything they had refused to see. The father, the provider, the builder, the man who had already given them more than they could ever repay. Her eyes filled with tears, sudden and unbidden, as if the weight of years had finally descended upon her shoulders in a single moment. She had told him to stay quiet, dismissed him with a wave of her hand, rolled her eyes when he tried to speak. She had spoken words meant to cut him down, words that reduced him to the background of her life. And now every one of those words returned like ghosts, swirling around her, suffocating her with the cruelty she had once delivered so easily. Every sigh, every moment she had treated him as an inconvenience, every harsh command to remain silent now rang in her ears, louder than the laughter that had just died at the table. She looked at the paper in front of her, but she could not truly see the words. What she saw instead were the sacrifices hidden behind them, the hands that had blistered so she could grow, the nights he had labored so she would never know hunger, the dreams he had quietly buried so she could chase her own. And she realized, with a shame so deep it hollowed her chest, that she had tried to erase the very man who had written her existence in sacrifice. Memories assaulted her without mercy. She saw herself as a little girl, sitting on his shoulders at parades, gripping his calloused hands as he guided her across busy streets, resting her head against his chest when the world felt too big. She remembered the smell of his jacket when he came home from work, tired but smiling, carrying groceries instead of gifts for himself. She remembered crying as a teenager over foolish heartbreak, and how he sat awake all night, silent, waiting for her tears to dry. And then she remembered how she had repaid that love, with indifference, with dismissal, with cruelty disguised as maturity. The tears spilled down her cheeks now, hot and unrelenting, carving shame into her face for all to see. Her husband's pale disbelief, her children's lowered eyes, none of it mattered. She felt only the crushing truth that she had betrayed the man who had given her everything. She had reduced him in her heart to nothing more than a burden, when in reality he had been the architect of every comfort she enjoyed. The house, the table, the life she thought was hers, none of it would have existed without it. And still, he did not look at her with anger. His face was calm, his silence unshaken, his dignity untouchable. That was what broke her most of all. He did not need to punish her with words. His quiet presence, the steady weight of the truth he had laid before them, was enough to unravel her completely. For the first time in her life, she felt smaller than he was, not because of his authority, but because of the greatness of his sacrifice. Sacrifice she had chosen to forget, until it stood before her in black ink and unbearable silence. He did not shout. His voice did not rise to tear through the air, because it was not needed. He did not accuse, for accusations would have been too small, too fragile, compared to the truth already resting on the table. Justice stood not in fury, but in silence, a silence that pressed against every heart in that room like a weight no one could lift. The inheritance statement lay before them, not merely a document, but a verdict, a mirror reflecting their betrayal back upon them. Betrayal had spoken first with mocking words, with dismissive glances, with cruel laughter, but the last word belonged to him, and it required no sound. The silence was unbearable. It seeped into the walls, into the flickering candles, into the untouched plates of food. The very air trembled with it, a silence thicker than storm clouds, heavier than stone. His daughter wept quietly, tears sliding down her face, while her husband's hands clenched beneath the table, unable to disguise his shame. The grandchildren sat stiff, phones abandoned, their youthful arrogance extinguished by the crushing realization of who truly sat before them. And he sat unmoving, steady, dignified. His face carried no anger, no satisfaction, no need for triumph. He had not laid down the paper to prove a point. He had laid it down because truth had waited long enough. Justice was not his revenge. It was the natural balance of time, the unveiling of reality they had tried to bury. His silence was not emptiness. It was power, a force stronger than rage, stronger than pride, stronger than any words he could have spoken. Every member of that family felt the judgment without it being delivered. They saw themselves reflected in the stillness. A daughter who had forgotten her father, a husband who had built his confidence on borrowed ground, children who had mocked the very root of their existence. Their betrayal screamed within them now, louder than their laughter had ever been. And still, he did not speak. His silence told them everything, that he did not need their validation, that his dignity did not depend on their recognition, that his worth was already carved into the legacy they could never take away. It was justice without fury, justice without noise, the kind of justice that lingered long after words faded, the kind that carved itself into memory, unshakable and permanent. They would remember this night not for his anger, but for the way he did not need it. His silence was the gavel, his truth was the sentence, and his presence, calm, unbroken, was the reminder that no betrayal, no dismissal, no cruelty could erase the truth of who he was. Her daughter's chest rose and fell unevenly, as if every breath now cut against her ribs. The paper lay before her like a wound she had inflicted herself, and she could not look away. Regret swelled in her heart until it was almost too heavy to bear. Every careless sigh, every time she told him to step aside, every bitter thought she had spoken behind his back, all of it came alive again in her memory, not as passing moments, but as sharp blades turned inward. She had wounded him, and now the wounds belonged to her. She saw him as he was, not as she had pretended him to be. She remembered his hands repairing her school bag late at night, so she could walk proudly among her friends. She remembered the winter mornings when he left before dawn, his boots soaked in frost, so she could stay warm in her bed. She remembered his face at her wedding, trying to smile while hiding the exhaustion of a man who had spent every last coin to give her joy. These memories had been drowned in her arrogance, ignored in her comfort, buried under the illusion that she had risen above him. But now they came back like an ocean, flooding her with truth. Her tears blurred the room around her. She could barely hear the clinking of dishes or the nervous shifting of her children. All she heard was silence. His silence, unbreakable, piercing deeper than any accusation. She wanted to speak, to beg, to undo the words she had spoken, but shame sealed her lips. To speak now would not heal. It would only expose her further. The weight of regret pressed on her chest until it was hard to breathe. And still, he did not look at her with anger. His eyes carried no vengeance, no fire, only a stillness that hurt more than rage ever could. He was beyond the reach of her cruelty now. He had risen to a place where she could no longer touch him with words. His silence was not indifference. It was judgment, wrapped in dignity. He would not lower himself to strike back, and that truth burned her more than any punishment could. She had betrayed the very man who had carried her life in his hands. She had thrown stones at the foundation that still held her upright. And now, as the weight of regret pressed into her, she realized it was too late to erase what had been spoken. Some words, once said, carved themselves into eternity, and hers had carved a wound not into him, but into her own heart. The son-in-law, who had so often filled the room with his arrogance, lowered his eyes at last. The smirk that once clung to his lips had vanished hours ago, replaced by a silence he could not escape. He sat stiffly, his hands restless in his lap, his confidence stripped bare under the weight of truth. Power had shifted in a way he could never have imagined, not through confrontation, not through raised voices or heated arguments, but through the stillness of a man he had underestimated. He realized now, with a cold sinking in his stomach, that the ground beneath his own success had never belonged to him. Every step he had taken in life, every comfort he had enjoyed in this house, every privilege he had flaunted before others, all of it had been paved not by his own effort, but by the silent strength of the man at the end of the table, the very man he had mocked. Memories assaulted him with sudden clarity. He recalled his private complaints about how the old man never contributed, the careless jokes he shared with friends about having to tolerate a father-in-law who just took up space. He remembered pushing him aside in conversations, pouring wine for others and letting his glass sit empty, dismissing him as irrelevant in the life he claimed to control. But tonight, the inheritance statement lay before him like a mirror, and in it, he saw not the weakness he had imagined, but his own borrowed pride. He had built nothing, he had inherited everything, and the architect of his stability was the man he had dismissed as useless. His pride shrank further as he dared a glance at his children. Their wide, shamed eyes mirrored his own realization that the laughter they had shared came at the expense of the very man who had given them the lives they took for granted. And then his gaze shifted to his wife, her face streaked with tears, her body shaking under the weight of regret. In her silence he saw the truth. She, too, had finally recognized the measure of her father. The room was united not in joy, not in love, but in humiliation, crushed beneath the stillness of the one they had rejected. He bowed his head slightly, not out of courtesy, not out of respect, but out of defeat. It was an instinct, the body's natural surrender to power that could not be denied. For the first time he understood that he had not been the man of this house. He had merely been a tenant, allowed to dwell in a space held together by sacrifice he could neither comprehend nor repay. The power he thought was his had belonged all along to the man who sat silently, eyes steady, unshaken, unbroken. The bow was small, hesitant, but it was enough to mark the shift. He, who once spoke over the old man, could no longer lift his head to meet his gaze. Pride had turned to ash in his mouth. He was left only with the bitter truth that his arrogance had been built on another man's foundation. He rose slowly, the movement quiet but commanding, as though the weight of the entire room shifted with him. His chair scraped softly against the floor, yet the sound struck sharper than thunder in their ears. He took his time, not in defiance, but in steadiness, every gesture deliberate, unhurried, unshaken. With one hand he folded his worn jacket across his arm, the fabric frayed but carrying the scent of years, the mark of work, the memory of sacrifice. He left the paper where it lay, untouched by him now, because it belonged there, not as a gift, not as a weapon, but as truth, resting before the eyes that had once refused to see. He looked at no one. He demanded nothing. He did not wait for gratitude, nor did he pause for apologies that would now mean little. He had not lived for their recognition, and he would not rise now to claim it. His dignity had never been tied to their acceptance. It was his alone, carved through years of labor, through the silence of endurance, through sacrifices they could never measure. That dignity was already his companion, and it walked with him now, stronger than the regret that hung like a chain around every other heart in that room. His daughter wept openly, the sound muffled against her trembling hand. Her husband kept his head bowed, as though afraid that lifting his eyes would expose him further. The children sat frozen, their laughter long buried, their shame raw and new. None of them moved, none of them dared speak, for they all knew that no words could soften the truth he had placed before them. And still he asked for nothing. He rose not as a man demanding justice, but as one who already carried it within himself. The room seemed smaller as he walked away, his steps unhurried, steady as a drumbeat of finality. The warmth of the candles dimmed, the food lost its flavor, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier in his absence. They had reduced him, humiliated him, treated him as though he no longer belonged. Yet in the end, it was his presence that had defined the night, and it was his departure that left them hollow. He did not turn back. He did not need to. Behind him, regret filled the silence he left behind. Ahead of him, dignity guided his path. He stepped into the cool air of the night, free from the weight of their cruelty, carrying nothing but himself, his silence, his truth, his name. And though they sat broken in the house he had given them, it was he who walked away whole. When he stepped outside, the night air embraced him like an old friend, cool against his skin, steady against the heat of shame and regret that still burned behind the walls he had left. He drew one slow breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he knows a chapter has closed, not with shouting, not with fury, but with truth so heavy it left silence in its wake. Behind him, through windows glowing with light, his family sat broken, unmoving, their laughter long extinguished. A house once filled with voices had fallen into a graveyard of shame. They had asked why he was there. They had mocked his presence, questioned his place, treated him as an intruder at his own table. But now, in the crushing quiet that followed his departure, they finally knew. He had been there because every wall around them bore his name. Every brick, every roof tile, every door they opened with confidence was his legacy. The chairs they sat in, the table they feasted at, the very lives they lived so comfortably, all of it had been written in his sacrifice. His name was not just on the inheritance statement lying before them. It was in the foundation of their house, in the ink of their security, in the blood that had built their future. They had forgotten. They had erased him with cruelty. But the truth stood unshaken. Everything they claimed as theirs had begun with him. Inside, his daughter still wept, her hand pressed against the paper that burned her with its weight. Her husband sat hollow-eyed, stripped of his arrogance, aware that he had been nothing but a guest in another man's empire. The children, who once sneered at his old shoes and his quiet presence, now stared at each other in shame, realizing they had laughed at the hand that had fed them, clothed them, lifted them without ever demanding thanks. Each of them sat with the heavy knowledge that the man they had reduced to nothing had been their everything all along. But he did not look back. To look back would have been to ask for something, an apology, a word, a crumb of recognition, and he needed none of it. His dignity was not theirs to give, and his worth was not theirs to measure. He walked into the night with the calm of a man who had nothing left to prove. He had shown them the truth without raising his voice, without lifting his hand, without striking a blow, and that truth would live longer than their shame, echo louder than their cruelty, endure beyond their betrayal. No betrayal could erase his name. No insult could undo the years he had poured into their lives. His silence was eternal, his legacy unshakable. They would sit in that house for years to come, surrounded by the walls he had given them, walking floors his hands had built, living lives his sacrifices had paid for. And though they might try to forget, every corner of that home, every comfort they touched, every inheritance they clung to, would whisper his name. He did not need to be remembered with gratitude. He did not need to be praised in words or honored in speeches. His name was already carved into stone, into ink, into the life of every person at that table. Long after their voices faded, his legacy would remain. He was the beginning of their story, and though they had tried to erase him, they could never write him out. He was there, quiet, steady, unshaken, and though he walked alone into the night, it was they who were left with the emptiness of regret, while he carried the fullness of truth.